Hey guys, I hope you're doing well today. I'm going to start out with a quote from Frank Herbert. He once said, "Deep in the human unconscious is a pervasive need for a logical universe that makes sense. But the real universe is always one step beyond logic." This is from his book Dune, where he kind of explores the interface between religion, politics, and the advances of science. And I think it's an interesting concept to kind of keep in mind as we go through our study of bioethics today. As we've talked about genetic engineering and begin to look at the process of how we decide what is and isn't okay as the sciences advance, it can be a difficult task to regulate. And who gets to make those decisions? And what are the right decisions to make? And so let's examine bioethics. As we look at our essential questions, keep these things and what we've learned previously in mind in terms of what are you okay with and why. Number one, what relationship does bioethics share with respect to our morals and values? Number two, what is the Hippocratic Oath and what is its purpose? Number three, what is eugenics and how has it been used historically? Number four, bioethics is the ethical analysis of any life-related biology topic. Give an example of a bioethical topic and relate the pros and cons, i.e. genetic engineering, cloning, CRISPR, animal research, PVS, etc. So how would you make a decision and why is that the decision that you would make with respect to how you would allow a particular technology to be utilized and unfold? And does that change over time? Let's start out by evaluating bioethics as a term. What does that exactly mean? In a kind of book definition, bioethics is the philosophical study of the ethical controversies brought about by advances in the science of biology. Okay, so basically, it's ethics relating to life technologies. So, what then is ethics? Well, ethics is a major branch of philosophy, and the point of ethics is the study of right conduct and good life. What's okay, what's not okay, what's good life, what is bad life, what is a right decision, what is a wrong decision. And ultimately, bioethics is going to deal very heavily with morality, values, and decision making related to biological advances. So let's delve a little bit deeper into this idea of ethics, how we decide if something is right or good. Those are such terms that are so difficult to identify, okay, difficult to nail down exactly what that means with respect to complicated situations. So let's begin by taking a look at the concept of morality. Now, morals are a code of conduct held to be authoritative in matters of right and wrong. These are created and defined by the society that you live in, philosophy, religion, and even the individual conscience. In the largest sense of the word, morals are the ideas about what is right or wrong that are shared by groups of people. Now, this has become complicated in today's day and age because no matter who you are or what you think is right and wrong, because of the age of the internet, the digital age, you can probably find someone somewhere that shares those ideals, which means you no longer have to kind of bounce your internal ideas for rightness or wrongness against those of the people that you live around. This is very different than when I was a kid because there wasn't as much travel, there wasn't an internet to go ahead and communicate with people you'd never met or seen before. Okay, you might have a pen pal that you had to write to on paper, but ultimately, when you looked to the people around you to kind of see if your ideas were normal or not, you looked to the people that lived around you, not to people who lived far away that were isolated, maybe in their basement somewhere. So things have changed, and the dissemination of information has really changed the way we view morality. We can look at the morals of a nation, but as we've seen recently, this is not consistent. We may split the country in half in terms of their belief systems. So what's right and what's wrong gets complicated. So let's take a step further and look underneath morals. The next level we really look at is this concept of values. So values are what are important to you as the individual, regardless of what other people around you may think. These are the things that are very personal. What are your personal values? And these are established based on your life experiences, groups you're members of, your age, your interests. So the things that kind of make up your life interactions and experiences define what you value as being important. And these values are considered subjective because they're from your perspective. And they tend to vary across people, across cultures. But ultimately, it's values that are very closely related to the choices that we make. You make decisions every day, whether you think about it or not. Do I get up in the morning? Do I decide to get dressed? What do I wear? What do I eat for breakfast? Do I not eat breakfast? Do I take the bus? Do I walk? Where do I get set up? Do I come to class? Do I not come to class? Who do I hang out with? Who do I talk to? Do I read? Do I do my homework? These are all decisions that you get the chance to make. But one of the big things we have to keep in mind with values is regardless of what we identify as important, that doesn't mean we're free from the consequences of the decisions that we do make. So ultimately, bioethics deals with making decisions based on medical information, the science itself, the regulating moral code, what does the larger group in your area say is okay and isn't, and lastly, personal and social values. What do you think is right? What do the people you're working with think is right? And this gets complicated. When we start thinking about some of the terms that have been thrown around in terms of terrorist, right? In terms of domestic terrorism, these types of things. Somebody obviously believed very strongly that what they were doing was the right thing. But it didn't match up with what was identified as the correct thing in terms of the societal morals. Does that make it right or wrong? And who's the one that decides that? Okay. When we are part of a country, we tend to go ahead and assume that the governing body of the country makes those decisions. But in a country like the United States, who selects the people that make those decisions? So when we start thinking about things like voting, about making your voice heard, it's important to think about your decisions. When we start looking at Facebook or Twitter or any social media, this is a great example of how you make decisions. I think most of us at some point in time have probably shared something on social media that we didn't have all of the evidence for, didn't have any knowledge about whether it was right or wrong. When we share information, we are giving our voice to something that may or may not actually be accurate. I mean, think about how rumors spread among your peers. Do you fact check before you go ahead and say something to somebody else about something you heard? Did you hear it correctly? Do you share it even if you didn't hear it correctly or are unsure if you heard it correctly? So we make so many decisions throughout our life, and they are largely based on our morals and values. Ultimately, we have to sleep with those decisions, but it impacts far more than just the person making the decision. Now, I want to talk a little bit more about tying this into genetic engineering and biosciences. How many of you are familiar with Hippocrates? Maybe you're not familiar with him, but maybe you at least like the name sounds something familiar. Is there a word that's popping to your mind right now that is similar to Hippocrates? Yeah, hypocrite, right. Let's come back to that. Hippocrates was an ancient Greek physician, and was considered one of the most outstanding figures in the history of medicine. In many cases, he's referred to as the father of modern medicine and is credited with being the first physician to reject superstition and beliefs that credited supernatural or divine forces causing illness. Before Hippocrates, most people believed that when you got sick, it was because you were somehow damned or cursed by the gods. Okay, this is why some of the treatments included things like bloodletting, and all sorts of various treatments that were not super scientific. He was the first one to think, well, I think you get sick for some reason other than just being a bad person or making the gods angry. And to this day, we have a remnant of Hippocrates known as the Hippocratic Oath. Now, the oath is an oath taken traditionally by physicians pertaining to the ethical practices of medicine. And while this is attributed to Hippocrates, their sources kind of differ on whether he actually wrote it. What we do have is a large batch of writings that the concept of the Hippocratic Oath seems to be reflected in. In his book, Epidemics, Book 1, Section 11, he says, declare the past, diagnose the present, foretell the future. Practice these acts. As to diseases, make a habit of two things, to help or at least to do no harm. Now, if you've ever watched a medical TV show, something like Grey's Anatomy or something, I'm sure you've heard something similar to this. They draw on these types of discussions that take place in these early things. So at this point in time, I would encourage you to go ahead and stop the video. Remember where you're at time-wise, and go ahead and do the assignment on the Hippocratic Oath. Read through or listen to me read through the Hippocratic Oath, and then go ahead and answer the questions related to that. When we take a look at the Hippocratic Oath, this is an important document, and I want you to really think about what it means for somebody to take this. Because whether you're a physician, whether you're a surgeon, whether you're a veterinarian, you still take some version of this oath. And what does that mean your duty is as a doctor to the society at large? Because ultimately, I mean, I think we forget this sometimes, but the doctor is there to serve you. But that's a pretty great power because they may have the ability to take life as well as to cure the patient. It's a pretty big responsibility. So I would encourage you to go do that right now and then come back here and pick up where you left off. Okay, well, welcome back. Now I'd like to go ahead and think about the idea of the role of medicine and what it does in your life and what its job is in society. And let's take a look at the ethical issues surrounding some key medical advances and start thinking about how biotechnology really is this interface between science and society. Okay, bioethics, this interface with the decisions we make based on our morals and values, which we've already pointed out change over time. What we believed in the past may not be what we believe in the present. And as such, we have to constantly be reevaluating our technologies and what we are and aren't okay with. And this relates back to the video that you watched previously over CRISPR-Cas9. Okay. So what kind of ethical issues are we talking about? Now, these vary from things that are considered pretty benign to things that are still really controversial. And I accept that fact. And I hope that you will enter all of these with an open mind and kind of evaluate from a very scientific perspective the pros and cons of these technologies and what they could bring to us. In vitro fertilization, organ transplantation, abortion, cloning, prenatal diagnosis, eugenics, animal research, genetic engineering, and brain death. These are all, at some point in time at least, pretty hot button topics. Are you okay with it? Are you not okay with it? And why? Let's start out with IVF, or in vitro fertilization. In today's day and age, this is considered pretty accepted, widely accepted actually in most cases. It's a technique in which the egg cells are fertilized by the sperm outside of the woman's womb. The fertilized egg, or zygote, is then transferred to the patient's uterus with the intent to establish a successful pregnancy. The term in vitro, meaning in tube, is in contrast to in vivo, or in life, that which takes place inside the organism. Now, initially, IVF was developed to overcome infertility problems due to the fallopian tube. But it turned out that it was a successful means of battling infertility for many different issues. In fact, when it first came out, it was largely condemned by most religious groups as being against nature or against God's will. And children born via IVF were labeled as test tube babies and kind of seen as abnormal freaks of nature. However, today, there are a large number of individuals who are born via IVF. And you probably can't even tell them from anybody else because they look and act the same way as any other person. The only difference is how their life began, where we extract the egg from the ovary, collect a semen sample, fuse the two together, and following fertilization, implant the embryo into the uterus. Okay. Now, why is it that something that was considered so controversial at the time it came out is now largely something that people don't care about? What has changed in the morals of our society to make that more acceptable? And so these are the kind of questions I want you to continue to ask as you go through and look at these various topics. Okay? Is this a change in the science? Is this a change in our morals? Is this a change in our values? What impacts the change in how society views these different technologies? And where do you stand with respect to these technologies? Are you okay with it? Why? Why not? All right, let's move on. The next one is organ transplantation. An organ transplant is simply the moving of whole or part of an organ from one body to another for the purpose of replacing the recipient's damaged or failing organ with a working one from the donor. Now, depending on the organ, it can come from a living or a deceased donor. And the biggest issue regarding transplantation is whether or not the host body then accepts the transplant. I'm sure you've heard of instances where transplants have been rejected. This is why they try so hard to get matches in terms of so many of the proteins and blood types and everything. So they reduce the risk of rejection by the patient. Now, what kind of organs can be transplanted? It's quite a lot, actually. Heart, kidneys, liver, lungs, pancreas, intestines. Tissues can also be easily transplanted, and we do this routinely. Bones, tendons, even your cornea. Yeah, part of the eye. It's crazy. Heart valves, veins, skin. When we start looking at organ transplantation, there's a lot that can be shared or transplanted. And we got to kind of think about the impact of that. How many of these happen? Now, these numbers are old. I still haven't found a really good graphic that kind of updates these numbers. But to give you an idea, in the United States in the year 2000, we looked at these numbers for lung transplants, heart transplants, so on and so forth. Some of these show multiple organs, and by one of the highest is a kidney transplant you see there, because again, we have two. So you can function with just one. So living donors are more common in these particular instances. The intestine transplants are actually pretty low because we can actually resect or cut out small sections of the intestine with little impact on the organism. If you look at the numbers, the difference between living and cadaver or dead donors is actually pretty evenly split, favoring just a little bit more the deceased donating their organs. So again, when this first happened, we used to think this was pretty strange, taking somebody else's organs. But you have to realize that before that, we were actually using pig, horse, cow organs to help replace the failing organs of people. And so this is actually a better match. It's less likely to go ahead and be rejected and can save a patient's life. Okay? Again, this is one that probably most of you don't even question as being something that would be odd. The next one I want to talk about is definitely more controversial. Okay, so just to kind of set you up for that. So listen through it. I'm not trying to convince you one way or the other, but think about the science and the terminology. And we have to be a little careful in making sure we understand these small nuances in terms of the vocabulary. Let's start out with the term itself, abortion. Abortion is the removal or expulsion of an embryo or fetus from the uterus, resulting in or caused by its death. Now, that last part is important, resulting in or caused by its death. So this does not limit us to just human-caused abortions, which is the term that we typically use. Okay, when we say abortion, we usually mean those caused by humans. We have a special name that we use for more naturally occurring spontaneous abortions. And the spontaneous expulsion of a fetus or embryo before the 20th week is commonly known as a miscarriage. Now, miscarriages can be a big deal and emotionally very difficult on the parents. In fact, my wife and I actually had 2 miscarriages, one before each of the children that we had. So we had one before we had Jonah and one before we had Finn. And it's complicated. The emotional impact is a big deal. So I can understand why this concept is a difficult one and can be controversial. Now, when we use the term in most circles, abortion, we typically mean an induced abortion. And this is the removal or expulsion of an embryo or fetus by medical, surgical, or other means during any point during the pregnancy for therapeutic or elective reasons. And the numbers, I'm sure, are probably bigger than I have here. The approximate number of induced abortions performed worldwide in 2003 was 42 million. Now, as soon as we throw out that million, that seems astronomically large. But you also have to think about the fact that the global population is over 7.6 billion people at this point. Billion, not million. Okay. And so what's the scale? What percentage are we looking at in terms of those? And before you start thinking that this is some product of the corrupt morals of a modern society, realize that abortion dates back to basically the dawn of humans. Throughout recorded history, abortion has always existed, but it's been in various different forms. Okay, if you go back to ancient China, they used to give botanical drugs to go ahead in terms of teas to force labor to happen early, which would cause the death of the child. If you go back to caveman days, they would actually beat the stomach of the pregnant woman until she miscarried. Okay, because in many cases, like wild animals, we start seeing that they don't want competition, and so they want it to be their offspring, not somebody else's offspring. If you go back to the courts of Europe, you have cases of documented using sharp tools or abdominal pressure to cause abortion to happen. Now, the moral and legal aspects of abortion are subject to intense debate in many parts of the world, and the United States is a prime example of that. It's been happening for a long time, and people have abortions for different reasons. What we have to stop and think about is when we legislate, when we try and make these decisions as a group, we have to remember that people have different morals, different values, and is it our right to go ahead and tell them how they should or should not handle it? All right, that's a complicated thing to start thinking about. And when is it okay and when is it not okay? Are you okay in the first trimester, in the second trimester? How about in the third trimester? These are all very different situations that have very different impacts on the individual carrying the child and the child once they're potentially here. Okay, so it becomes very complicated, and we have to think about the impact of the decisions that we're making on everybody involved in the situation. All right. Okay, so we'll move on, but the next one is also often considered quite controversial. Okay, the next one is cloning. Now, cloning, by its very sense, is simply the process of making an identical copy of something. In the wild, bacteria reproduce by cloning. So there are a lot of species out there that don't go through sexual reproduction like we think of, and they simply copy themselves. So it's a clone. In biology, it collectively refers to the process used to create copies of DNA fragments. We have molecular cloning, cellular cloning, okay, which is what these organisms do, or organism cloning. So when we usually think of the word cloning, we're thinking of copying an entire person or cow or whatever it is that we're copying. So we have to kind of think about what the term means versus how we use it. Okay, so how the general population uses these terms versus what they actually mean are slightly different. So a clone is essentially a member of the population of genetically identical cells produced from a single cell. Your body, if you look at all the cells that are around in a patch of skin, are all clones of each other. But before we start thinking this is somehow weird or strange, we have to remember that clones occur in nature, right? We just talked about asexual reproduction, whether it's in plants, bacteria, even some animals can go ahead and do this. But we also know how this works in humans. If you've ever met a pair of identical twins, you already know what a clone is like. If you thought that they were going to be somehow freakishly scary, if you've ever talked to twins, you know that they're actually quite different. They may look very similar, but because their environmental factors, their life experiences are different, they're not the same person. Okay. We've been using cloned bacteria in the laboratory to do all sorts of things like the recombinant DNA technology we talked about that produces human insulin or human growth hormone. This is a process of cloning, and it's not new, and we've been using it for quite some time. The first time it became very controversial, however, was around the time of 1997 when the first mammal was cloned. This was the sheep Dolly. Since then, we've cloned cows, pigs, mice, and other mammals, including some higher primates. There's actually a lab up in Portland that has actually done some cloning of monkeys. And if that hurdle has been bridged, it's very easy to say, yeah, we could go ahead and clone humans. Now, these clones are not transgenic, okay? So before we start thinking about some weird mutant clone that's going to come out, no. What we're talking about here is not something with foreign DNA, but something that is created as an exact copy starting with the same nuclear DNA as another organism. And researchers that are working in these fields do hope that one day these advantages will lead to the production of transgenic animals that produce genetically engineered substances that may have medical or scientific value. You think about what we've been doing in terms of recombinant DNA and getting them to produce human insulin. Well, what if we could go ahead and get biomaterials grown on a plant or on an animal that we could harvest directly from that animal that we just copy then and make a ton of copies of to harvest the material? I digress. Let's go ahead and take a look at the process of cloning Dolly so you can get an idea of what happened and how it worked. So first of all, we take a donor cell from a sheep's udder. That gives us the donor nucleus, which is what we're going to go ahead and use to clone. We then extract an egg cell from an adult female sheep, and then we take out the nucleus. So we've got an egg that has no nucleus in it, and we go ahead and fuse the egg cell with that donor nucleus, okay, so that we end up with a new fused cell. When this happens, there's some sort of reprogramming process that the cell does. We don't know all of the details about how this works, but essentially it considers itself a fertilized egg, and it begins to go through the normal division, just like you would see any fertilized egg, and grows towards an embryo. Once this occurs, they then place that embryo into a foster mother. You could use the same mother that you extracted the egg cell from in the first place. And then the egg cell grows and produces the new baby offspring, in this case, a cloned lamb, which had the same DNA as its parent, and they named that Dolly. Here's Dolly as an adult. And right next to Dolly, the little baby you see there is actually her naturally occurring offspring, Bonnie. So Bonnie is not a clone. Excuse me, Bonnie is actually a regular baby produced in natural ways from Dolly, the clone. So let's take a look at cloning really quickly and get an idea of how this works. All right. So the video link seems to be broken, but essentially what you do is you go ahead and extract the DNA from the skin cell in this case, and then you insert it into the egg cell after removing its nucleus. You get that reprogramming process and it begins dividing before you go ahead and implant it. Now, prenatal testing is the testing for diseases or conditions in a fetus or embryo before it's born. The aim here is to detect birth defects such as neural tube defects, Down syndrome, chromosome abnormalities, genetic diseases, and other conditions, including the sex of the offspring. The rise in designer babies, and especially this potential with respect to CRISPR, and parent selection of traits raises a whole bunch of bioethical and legal issues, which I think will dominate reproductive rights debates as we move on in the 21st century. All right. Now, prenatal diagnosis is definitely something that my wife and I went through as well. We were considered older parents when we had our children, and as such, they really wanted us to do a lot of genetic testing and to go ahead and make sure, using all sorts of tests, that the baby was going to be fine. Now, one of the things that they really kind of encourage us to do is called an amniocentesis. Now, how many of you know what an amniocentesis is? Okay, so maybe you do, maybe you don't. Essentially, what they do is they extract amniotic fluid from around the fetus because it shares the same DNA, and then they spin up a karyotype like we talked about the other class period to go ahead and look for any chromosome number abnormalities or missing segments of any chromosomes. As you can see in this illustration, what they do is they use ultrasound to kind of guide the needle in, but yes, there is a very large needle that is inserted into the amniotic sac that extracts some of the cells to go ahead and do the karyotype. Now, my wife and I opted not to have the amniocentesis done. Remember, we had already had a miscarriage before we had our children, before we had Jonah, and so we didn't want to risk another miscarriage, and so we said that this wasn't worth the risk, as regardless what the outcome was in terms of the chromosomes, we were still going to have the baby. And so that's a very personal decision, and you may know people that made a different decision, and that's okay. Their values, their morals guided them to make a different choice, and that's fine. That's part of why we're having this discussion, is to be able to talk about those differences. But this is the process, this is how it works, and there are potential risks. All right. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at another possible target as well. This is what's known as eugenics. Has anybody heard of eugenics before? Okay, so eugenics essentially is a social philosophy which advocates for the improvement of human hereditary traits through various forms of intervention. Historically, this was done through selective breeding, choosing mates. Only certain people were fit to go ahead and breed. But in modern days, this has changed a little bit, okay? in the modern focus, this is including things like the prenatal testing and screening we were just talking about, genetic counseling, use of birth control, in vitro fertilization, and as we move into the future, potentially genetic engineering. So can you think of any instances where we in humanity have used this? If you're interested in this topic, there is a great movie that if we were in school, we would probably watch called GATTACA, G-A-T-T-A-C-A, with Ethan Hawke and Uma Thurman. And it does a great job discussing issues surrounding eugenics and who has the right to determine what traits are valuable and what traits are chosen. It also takes a look at, well, when we look at genetic potential, how certain are the results we have from this, okay? So throughout history, eugenics has been regarded by various advocates as a social responsibility. That if we can create healthier humans, we can lower the strain or burden on society, lower healthcare costs, lower food needs, more intelligent, healthier people. This saves resources and lessens human suffering. However, there are a minority of eugenic advocates that have used it as a justification for state-sponsored discrimination. They have forced sterilization on persons deemed genetically defective and used it to kill institutionalized populations. Eugenics was one of the rationale referenced in the Holocaust. So how do we view eugenics? We think about our country, the United States. That was actually one of the founding principles when we started thinking about how we were going to form a better nation, a more tolerant nation that was okay with various religious beliefs, people from various backgrounds, the ultimate melting pot. And so we saw this as eugenics being the self-directed aspect of human evolution. This was an extension of what we'd been trying to do to create a much better and perfect union. But as much as we love that, we have to realize this is some of the same rationale that led to the Nazis discriminating against Jews, blacks, and gypsies because they were considered inferior. We think about the Aryan race. Okay? So a lot of these technologies, if you're looking at them, the technologies themselves are not inherently good or bad. However, while the technologies themselves aren't good or bad, how we choose to use them can be for good or for bad. And this is where your morals and values comes into play in terms of regulating how we use these technologies. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to animal research. Before I was a teacher, I used to run clinical trials in pharmaceutical companies. And so these are things that we've tested, I've dealt with, because before you can go ahead and do human clinical trials, you have to make sure that your drug is safe enough doing animal research before you can go ahead and move on to humans. Now, it's estimated somewhere between 50 to 100 million vertebrates are used worldwide, everything from zebrafish to non-human primates in a particular year. Notice that I said vertebrates. So these are animals with a backbone, but I'm sure there are far larger numbers than this for invertebrates, flies, worms, etc., because they don't actually have to be monitored and regulated in the same way and are largely unregulated and not included in any statistics in the United States. After the animal research is complete, because of the trials done on them, most of the animals are euthanized. Does everybody know what euthanization is? Yeah, this is when we put your animal down. If you have a pet that's old or sick, your pet gets euthanized or killed, okay? And so most of the animals in animal research, this is what happens to them at the end of the research. Now, what kind of research are we doing? This includes everything from genetics to developmental biology, behavioral studies, as well as much more applied research in biomedical, xenotransplantation. Does anybody know what xenotransplantation is? Okay, so xeno means foreign, and so a transplant of foreign material into the organism. So you take a look at this mouse down here in the bottom right-hand corner, and this mouse has a human ear growing on its back. Okay, they've done this to go ahead and grow the actual tissue of the ear in terms of the cartilage. The mouse cannot hear from its back. That's not how that works. But they did this so that if somebody lost an ear in a battle in the military or some sort of accident, they could regrow the tissue. It would be grown in a healthy, clean environment with blood. They could go ahead and cut it off and put it onto a patient so they would have a new ear. This has been done for drug testing. You have toxicology tests. You have cosmetics testing. Yes, cosmetics. Every piece of makeup that you use has to be tested to make sure that it's safe for human use. And in order to do that, who did they test it on? That's right, animals. Now, you may have a makeup that says not tested on animals. The only way that they could get the FDA to approve that is that if it's so similar to something that was already tested on animals that it's not largely different. So that should make you think about your makeup a little bit differently. This is true about everything from when we start looking at toothpaste or shampoo. These are all true examples of what we're talking about. Animals are also used for education, breeding, and defense research. Then we get to more modern genetic engineering, which directly manipulates an organism's genes. It uses techniques of molecular cloning, transformation, a lot of the stuff we talked about with recombinant DNA technology, and have had some really good successes improving crops. We see some of our GMO crops, everything from corn to rice to cotton that we talked about that you guys did in your little research paper. The manufacture of synthetic human insulin is now done by bacteria. We also look at the production of things like erythropoietin, human growth hormone, as well as producing identical clones that are designed for particular experiments in terms of mice and stuff like that. This goes a step further because in 1985, the US Patent and Trademark Office, or PTO, affirmed the legal precedent ruling that genetically engineered plants, seeds, and animal tissues could be patented. So you, quote unquote, made this new organism. That's crazy when you start to think about it. There are actually a lot of lawsuits about this. Monsanto has some that have gotten some of their genes out into the wild, and they're suing farmers who ended up not paying for their genes, but getting them because the wind blew some of the genetic material in terms of pollen from one field into another. Who has rights to those? Some of your companies, like Monsanto, have actually built in obsolescence into some of their crops so that you have to come back and buy the seeds again later on. So who has the right to own life technologies? What are the limits of genetic engineering? Now in Times Square in New York, there's a company that opened up a store called GenPets. You can see the picture here. And you can go check out their website, genpets.com. I'd encourage you to do so, where you actually get to get your own genetically modified pet. You get to pick its traits. What color is it? How much fur does it have? It starts out looking like this, but you get to decide a lot of the characteristics of what your pet looks like. Is that cool or is that scary? All right, take a minute, think about that. Would you want one? How many of you would want to get a Chen pet? Pause the video and think about how you feel about designing your own pet and if you're okay with that. It's its own species. It's not some dog or cat. It's a gen pet. That's what it is. That's its own species. So pause the video and think about whether you want it. All right, did you go look it up? What'd you decide? Well, before you get too crazy into this and spending a whole bunch of money potentially on doing it, it's not real. Okay, this was an art exhibit done by an artist who wanted people to think about the impacts of genetic engineering. Okay, what is the potential for genetic engineering? What do we have to be afraid of? What do we need to know? Are we okay with it? Are we not okay with it? These are the questions he wanted people to think about. But he did rent space in Times Square and did open up a store, had these done by an artist that did movie magic, and they actually had so many pre-orders. And that first day, there were lines outside the door and way down the sidewalk for people that wanted to buy them. Okay, people signed up because they didn't tell them right away that this is what this was. And people made a big deal out of it. And it was considered this crazy big thing. So now I want to go ahead and move on to brain death and PVS. Now, are any of you familiar with PVS? Okay, so PVS is persistent vegetative state. That's where the individual is alive, typically by machines, but they're carrying out their life processes. Okay, they're just not responsive. Now, in the 1960s, they came up with the concept of brain death as the legal definition for death. And this was a response to the ability to resuscitate individuals and mechanically keep the heart and lungs functioning. So once technology got to a point where it could help keep an individual alive, we had to have what a legal definition would be for death. And so in simple terms, brain death is the irreversible end of all brain activity. The individual then is never coming back, even if you keep them mechanically alive with something helping their heart pump blood and their lungs to keep breath going into the body. Now, this actually has some pretty major ramifications if you stop to think about it, because as technology improves, our ability to keep the body alive without necessarily having the mind alive becomes an increasing possibility. So PVS is a state of wakefulness without detectable awareness. The individual is alive in all physical senses of the word, but is essentially catatonic. Recent functional neuroimaging results have shown that some parts of the cortex are still functioning in vegetative patients. And in some rare circumstances, people have come out of a vegetative state and gone on to be normally functional after that, sometimes temporarily, and in very few cases, permanently. So this ethical issue raises questions about autonomy, being able to function by yourself. What is your quality of life at that point? And how much in terms of resources should you use, right? If you're on ventilators, if you're kept on life support, so to speak, with your lungs and heart being kept functional by machines, how much does that cost? How much of your family's resources do you take to keep that going? In addition, what are the wishes of your family members? Do they want to keep trying? And how long do they want to keep trying? What is the professional responsibility of the doctor at that point to determine what still constitutes life and whose belief system, the physician or the patient or the families, ends up winning out in terms of defining what is still considered life? And there's a lot more, and we could keep getting into the sticky weeds about these definitions and whose right it is to choose this. This became really apparent with a particular case study around Terry Schiavo. Now, this is exactly what it was. She had a neurodegenerative disorder where her body was beginning to shut down and her brain was beginning to shut down. And originally, her thoughts and feelings about this were that yes, she would like to be kept alive on machines. But as things deteriorated and her body started to fail her and her brain started to lose some of its grasp, she had a big conversation with her husband and said that she did not want to be kept alive on machines. And she wrote these wishes on a napkin and gave them to him. And so there is a note and that is signed by her, and this ended up being a huge court case. She lapsed shortly after signing the napkin and going into this state into PVS, or persistent vegetative state. She was not recognized as dead because she still had brain activity, but she was very likely never going to come out of her vegetative state as her body was failing. And the machines were really keeping her alive. Now, the napkin suggested that her wish was to not be kept alive on machines, and her husband kept reiterating this, but her family was heavily religious and believed that that essentially constituted suicide, and so they insisted that her beliefs as being a good Catholic girl were that she would be kept alive. Okay, and so the court case lasted for 7 years, where they debated whether or not to remove the feeding tube and let her just expire. Now, her husband stated that her wishes were not to stay in a vegetative state, but again, her parents focused on her Catholic upbringing and did not believe that she would want this. It took that 7 years of her in the vegetative state, which had a huge financial burden for her husband and their, but it also had the legal costs. And when we started coming down to it, eventually the court felt that her rights were the most important, and that it appeared to be, based on all evidence, that her wish was to not be kept alive in a vegetative state. And once the court case was finished, and it did go to an appellate court, and so it was challenged from the initial ruling, and it was again upheld that she did not want to be kept alive. They pulled out the feeding tube, turned the machines off, and she died within a matter of days. Okay. These things are complicated, and when we start thinking about life versus death decisions, okay, morals and values play a very large role in this. So I think increasingly, as we learn more and more about biology, as we understand increasing amounts about ethics, as we increasingly understand more about genetics, the interface of science and society becomes a very important place for our voices to be heard. And it is important that we educate ourselves to make the best decisions possible about the science that's advancing. And it is advancing at quite a rapid rate. And I think CRISPR is probably the most important recent example of this, because of what it could potentially mean for us as a species. So if you have any questions about any of these things, or just want to talk about ethical questions and issues surrounding medicine and bioethics, please don't hesitate to come in and talk to me. I feel passionate about this, but I also feel that you should make your own decisions. Don't rely on somebody else to tell you what the right decision is. You need to go ahead and educate yourself, learn about the science, and then make a value judgment. Do the pros outweigh the cons, or is it the other way around? There are implications for many of these things, especially with genetics, not only about the human species, but the impact on the planet and the ecology of our planet as well. So I hope you'll keep these things in mind, but don't hesitate to come ask questions. All right, hope you guys have a great rest of your day. Take care of yourselves, and we'll see you soon. Good night.